Good morning, everybody. This hearing session is now open. It forms part of the examination of the Merton local plan, and my name is RJ Aston, and along with my colleague G.J. Fort, we are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearing is a structured and focused discussion that we shall lead. Now, there are some preliminary matters and a bit of housekeeping that I need to do as well. The introductions first, please, from the Council.
Tara Butler, Merton Council.
Eben van der Westhuizen, Merton Council.
Thank you. And others on the round table and on Zoom, please.
Ian Simpson, trustee of the Wimbledon Society.
Christopher Coombe for the Wimbledon Society.
Josh Thomas, Rolf Job Planning, on behalf of the All England Lawn Tennis Club.
Oh, Joyce Lowe from Barton Wilmore Now Stantec.
Lauren Patel from Barton Wilmore Now Stantec, representing Tooting and Mitcham and Leisure Limited.
Nigel Bennett from Magenta Planning, also representing Tooting and Mitcham Leisure Limited.
Thank you. And on Zoom, please.
Alice Roberts from CPRE. Alice Roberts from CPRE London.
Thank you.
Kate O'Donnell, Planning Officer, London Borough of Merton.
Thank you. The Programme Officer for the examination is Carmel Edwards, who should be the main point of contact prior to and after the hearing sessions and should be copied into all correspondence. Now would be a good time to switch off mobile phones or at least turn them to silent. And please could the Council indicate the procedures in the event of a fire and whether any tests are due, and also advise participants on the location of facilities, please.
Thank you. The toilets are fully accessible and they're located on the ground floor of this building, just beside the stairs or the lift just outside this door. There's also a water drinking dispenser just near there, and if you can't see it because it's behind a pillar, please ask the security guards. There are no fire drills scheduled during the hearing today. If the fire alarm sounds, either intermittently or continuously, please leave the building immediately by the nearest available fire exit without stopping to collect your belongings. Staff will direct you to the exits and the fire assembly point. If you're unable to use the stairs, a member of staff will assist you. There's an induction loop system for people with hearing difficulties in this chamber. And finally, there's also a Merton Council guest Wi-Fi that you can register for free Wi-Fi.
Thank you, Ms. Willer. The hearings are being filmed and live streamed to YouTube. Is everyone present comfortable with this? Thank you. Does anyone else intend to film or record the event? The matters to be discussed today will be focused questions based upon and taking forward the MIQs and the associated written statements that we have received. Inspector Fort and I are tasked with considering the soundness of the plan and in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist us in these regards. And in submitting the plan, the Council considers it sound, and this is the starting point for the examination. So, if you're challenging the soundness of the plan, then you have to explain to us why and what changes might be necessary that would make it sound. We have read and will consider the hearing statements that have been prepared and also the original representations that were made. There is no need for these to be repeated. Instead, our aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with specific questions that we have or areas where we require further clarification or an explanation. And at times we may ask for a general contribution or a summary of your position. And when contributing to discussions, it'd be helpful to us if you'd stick to the matters in hand and refrain from commenting on unrelated matters. I will come back to that in matter 5 in a moment. Now, in order to test the plan for soundness and legal compliance, Inspector Fort and I will need to ask questions. You'll have seen that we've already been doing this in our preliminary letters and other correspondence with the Council and in the published MIQ document. And both the Council and other participants have responded to these. The questions will continue today on those responses. However, anything that is asked should not be taken as demonstrating a particular view on our part. We will normally start a particular topic by asking the council for responses to questions that we have before indicating that we wish others to comment. And for those of you in the room, if you wish to comment, then please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side, or if you're joining us via Zoom, by using the hands up tool. We may also invite contributions from you on specific points where we think this may assist the examination. And in speaking during the hearing, we'd request that you're clear and concise. In particular, if you wish to highlight certain parts of your statements or other documents that form part of the examination, then it would be very helpful to us if you can provide the reference, please. Those present in the room should use the microphones when speaking to us. Please ensure that their positions as close as possible so that those following virtually can also hear what you're saying. Those joining us on Zoom will have to make sure they're unmuted when speaking to us, but muted at all of the times. And a gentle reminder for those on Zoom not to use the chat or emoji facilities, as they're not monitored by us during the sessions. If any of those joining on Zoom have technical difficulties, then please make contact with the programme officer in the first instance. Okay, so moving on. It's open to the council to propose further changes to the plan, and we would ask that they keep a record of possible changes that arise during these discussions. Any changes that would constitute main modifications would be subject to further consultation. However, no further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions have finished unless we specifically request otherwise. Moreover, we're not expecting any further written submissions during the course of these sessions, but we may request further material should discussions indicate to us that it would be relevant and useful. There'll also be a short session at the end of each sitting day to ensure any suggested modifications or additional items such as topic papers or evidence that we might have requested have been adequately recorded. Are there any questions at this stage about the procedural side of the hearings? No. Okay, in that case then, we will move on to matter 5. And this morning, we will be discussing the approach, or the plan's approach, to Metropolitan Open Land and whether it's justified, consistent with national policy, and in general conformity with the plan. To open the discussion, sorry about that. To open the discussion, I will invite the council in a moment to give a brief and general response to the issue as put. And that is, are the exceptional circumstances for any mole boundary alterations set out in the plan fully evidenced and justified? Is the need for any changes to mole established in strategic policies? And are the policies of the plan insofar as relevant to mole in general conformity with the London plan? Now, there's one thing I just want to clarify, I did mention earlier. I just want to clarify the scope of what we're discussing today relevant to the MIQs that we've posed. There'll be no substantive discussion on site WI3, although we do appreciate that it might come in to the discussion at some point today, and we do have a couple of points on that. And obviously those will be held in the timetable session next week. Okay, Ms. Butler.
Can I pass over to my colleague, Mr. Doyle, on Zoom?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Matter 5 focuses on the council's approach to Metropolitan Open Land, or MOLE as it is more commonly referred to. It is the council's view that the plan, along with the proposed modifications put forward, sets out a justified approach to MOLE, one which is consistent with national policy and is also in general conformity with the London plan. Merton has 9 mole sites, which total over 960 hectares of land. These sites are clearly illustrated on the policies map, document 0D2, and are also listed in the appendices to the submitted plan, document 0D1. These sites cover large areas of the borough, offering much valued green and open spaces to residents and visitors. Green infrastructure policies, O15.1 and O15.2 of the plan, clearly set out the council's intentions to protect and enhance mole in accordance with the NPPF and the London plan requirements. As set out in the London plan, which also reflects national policy, alterations to mole boundaries should be undertaken through the local plan process, and altered where exceptional circumstances are evidenced and justified. Our submitted documents, 15D1 Green Infrastructure Study 2020 and 18D3 Summary of Mole Policy Map Changes 2021, both set out how the initial review of sites was conducted by a consultant team, also in consultation with Friends of the Parks groups, and then followed up by further site reviews by the council. This process ensured that up-to-date evidence was used to inform the local plan, using methodologies in line with the London Plan Policy G3 criteria and the essential characteristics of Greenbelt as set out in the MPPF. The council is proposing 12 boundary amendments to Mole. However, it is important to note that no single Mole site in its entirety is proposed to be removed. The proposed boundary changes are minimal and are not of a strategic nature. Most of these are minor adjustments required to correct mapping errors and anomalies, or to reflect built form that has come forward through approved planning applications. Exceptional circumstances do exist for 2 of the proposed amendments, as discussed in more detail in the council's submitted statement to Matter 5. In conclusion, the council considers that the proposed amendments to the Mole boundaries in the plan are based on proportionate and up-to-date evidence, are in accordance with national policy, and are in general conformity with the London Plan.
Thank you. It was Miss O'Donnell, wasn't it? How would you prefer to be addressed? Miss.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the questions that we have this morning, there's just a few questions on the evidence base. There'll be some further questions from Inspector Fort on alterations to the boundaries before some questions about assessment criteria, and then we'll move on to the site allocation ML3 and the Thames Water site at Bygrove Road. So that's just a bit of a broad outline of where we're heading this morning. Miss O'Donnell, just for the purposes of the hearing, or Miss Butler, I don't know which one might take this, but can you just clarify what other reviews entailed for the purpose of the green infrastructure, please, the green infrastructure study, please? And then the second part of that is all of the evidence included in the examination library? Thank you.
I'll take this one, I think.
Yeah, Ms. O'Donnell, so I suppose the 5.13 of your hearing statement, so you've already mentioned the evidence base in general, but in terms of the hearing statement, it says the final recommendations are based on both the green infrastructure study and subsequent council reviews. So it's just a question of what those subsequent reviews are and whether they're included in the examination library as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so as we set out in the statement, obviously the green infrastructure study was an evidence-based document which kind of contained more evidence than just the Metropolitan Open Land review. So it went wider, and it was part of all of the green infrastructure study as part of the local plan evidence base. And then just for the Metropolitan Open Land portion of that study, the consultants reviewed each of the lands, each of the 9 land parcels of Metropolitan Open Lands, and conducted their studies as was set out in the evidence-based document 15D1. Because of the timing of that, obviously the local plan process conducts evidence base over a number of years. So that study was done in 2020. And obviously because a number of the Mole sites are obviously, there's an interest in those from everybody in the borough, from residents, from visitors, from applicants. And so the council wanted to make sure that all of the evidence was up to date as possible. So we continued site reviews for each of those pieces of Mole, and that evidence is document 18D3. So that kind of brings together the combination of reviews of the green infrastructure study undertaken by the consultants and the further studies by the council officers.
Ms.
We do
O'Donnell, can I
include,
just pause there for a moment,
yes.
please? Were those studies undertaken by officers of the council?
Yes, the 18D3 was, yes. So what that work included were kind of further site visits and assessments, as we set out in paragraph 5.12 of our statement. We also then did a quality check on the maps using our internal GIS system. We also then considered up-to-date evidence that was submitted by landowners of relevant sites such as MO3 and WI3. And then what we also did was then undertake a review of kind of a consolidated review and a consolidated overview of all of the council's evidence base that we had to date, such as document 11D8, which is the Merton Strategic Housing Market Assessment. And we also took into consideration consultation responses that had been fed through the local plan process at that point in time.
Thank you, Ms. O'Donnell. Was there anything any of the roundtable participants or on Zoom wanted to comment on the evidence base? Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, I'm unfamiliar with the process. Is this a point at which you would like to hear general observations from us on the evidence base and other issues, or will you come back to general issues in a moment?
Well, what we're asking is a series of structured questions, Mr. Coombe. So this is an initial question just to establish for the hearing exactly what was undertaken for the purposes of the green infrastructure study and what the term other reviews referred to. There's a second part of that about is all the evidence included in the examination library. So if we could just maybe just stick to anything specific on that point. If you have general points about the evidence base that underpin the green infrastructure study, then now would be the time to make them.
Perhaps we should just touch on one of those sites in the green infrastructure study and our confusion as to whether the GIS, as I'll call it, includes the land to the east of Church Road. I'd like to come back to that at this point later, but more detail on it. The GIS infrastructure study dealing with the All England site dealt only with the land to the west of Church Road, not the land to the east.
Ms. Butler, have you got a response to that?
Can I just say that there's no intention to move the Metropolitan Open Land boundary of the land to the east of Church Road. So there are no proposed changes to that.
Thank you.
So in terms of the alterations to Mole, are they clearly articulated in the plan itself, either in strategic policies or supporting text? So where if I was to read the local plan, where would I find that narrative? Is this one for Ms. Butler or Ms. O'Donnell?
I'm sorry, we can't see each other or no. So there is a bit of staccato going on. I can start, but if I can just invite Ms. O'Donnell in just in case she has something to add. Inspectors, with the addition of proposed modification as set out in our statement below paragraph 5.28, that proposed modification would be to LBM01 after paragraph 15.1.2. And it sets out two paragraphs, which would, if added to the local plan, would enable the reader to see the statement that you just requested. Can I just check if Mr. Doyle's got anything to add, please?
Thank you, Ms. Butler. Could I just add the fact that the policies map clearly shows, so the submitted policies map, which is document 0D2, clearly shows in an illustrative form all of the Metropolitan Open Land's boundaries within the borough. And these are this includes the boundary changes that have been made. So the submitted map is the proposed boundary changes. All of the 9 mole sites are also clearly listed in the appendix to the submitted plan, which is document 0D1. And in the council's submitted statement to Matter 5, because obviously the document is in a document format and the plan is in a mapping format, to put these in one location, we submitted an appendix to the statement, which illustrates a map of the borough with each of the Metropolitan Open Land sites, and these have been annotated with the references that are relevant from the appendices. So these comes directly from the GIS system, which shows that all of the sites are shown on the map and in the plan.
Yeah, so we've got a list of mole sites in the plan, and we've got the policies map. But in terms of the actual changes to the mole boundaries that are proposed, how is that articulated across, 1, in the text of the plan, and 2, on any sort of illustrative material? I don't think that necessarily has to be the policies map, but to make it clear that there are changes and where it's been changed. I appreciate there's a new mole boundary in the policies map itself, but not knowing what the previous one is, unless you've looked at a previous policies map, you perhaps don't get that clarity there that's expected from the National Planning Policy Framework in terms of making those kinds of changes.
I'll start with the answer and then maybe pass over. We believe that with the addition of the paragraph, the main modification as set out in our statement, paragraph 15.1.2, that indicates that there are boundary changes. As Mr. Doyle has said, these are on the policies map. They're in our evidence as well. I'd also encourage people to look at document 18D3, which clearly summarizes the before and after policies maps. So there's an image of the before, an image of the after to clearly illustrate changes. I'm just going to invite Ms. O'Donnell if she's got any words.
I think Ms. Butler has covered it. Those were the 2 points I would have made. Policy document, submitted document 18D3 shows the boundary changes in both a format from the 2014 policies map and the proposed 2021 policies map, plus the 2 new paragraphs proposed through main modification 15.0.
I think what we're trying to get at is it sufficiently clear in the plan? You've mentioned other documents that somebody picking up the plan would then have to refer to. Would it be more appropriate, for example, to somehow have listed these sites in the policy with some visual representation about what the boundary changes amount to? And it goes back to this point, doesn't it? Someone picking up the plan, doesn't want to then kind of be trawling through a lot of other documents to try and find what they need. So a suggestion is maybe that the council, other people might have some comments on this. I'll come to you in a moment. The suggestion is that maybe the council revisit that to see whether it's most appropriate to have it set out in the form proposed, including the modification, which does go some way to perhaps adding some clarity. But my question would be, does that go sufficiently far enough? I mean, just while you have a pause and have a think about that, if you wanted, Ms. Butler, did anyone else have any comments on this that they wanted to add?
Sorry. It was mentioned yesterday in the opening sessions how difficult it was to find documents. We're here for community organisations, and I understand the purpose of the planning process is to support the community organisations, a platform for local people to shape their surroundings, is the way the NPPF puts it. We've struggled to find our way through the documents. And in particular, I'd like to deal with WI3, and I appreciate you might want to come on to that later. The basic proposition in the green infrastructure study is not followed through in the recommendations from the council. I can go into detail later, perhaps. And as a result, we don't see any evidence base for the council not following the green infrastructure study recommendations.
Okay, a slightly different point, but relevant nonetheless. Thank you. Ms. Butler, did you want to just come back on the?
Yes. A suggestion is that the council reflects on the proposed modification 15.0, I think the one in your statement below paragraph 15.1.2 for additional clarity, and also that potentially as an appendix to the local plan, we add the evidence documents or an abridged version 18D3, which clearly shows the maps of each of the boundary amendments before and after, and it shows a small element of the reasons why the changes have been made. And then people could review that, and that would make it much clearer if that was embedded as an appendix to the plan.
Yeah, I think that's a sensible approach, Ms. Butler, and then thinking about how the policies and supporting text would refer to that appendix. And related to that, if I can take you to paragraph 140 of the framework. So it's talking about Greenbelt, but obviously the considerations apply to Mole. So that says, once established, boundaries should only be altered where exceptional circumstances are fully evidenced and justified through the preparation or updating of plans. Strategic policies should establish the need for any changes to Greenbelt boundaries. So as the plans submitted, does the strategic policy do that? Now, thinking about exceptional circumstances, you've outlined what the green infrastructure study and the related work has looked at in terms of Mole. So there's some what you refer to as minor amendments, but there still needs to be exceptional circumstances for their removal. But that can be because the character of the land doesn't contribute to Mole purposes. But in terms of the plan, does the strategic policy sort of support those changes, and two, are the exceptional circumstances then articulated? And that could be in the appendix, but just if I could have your initial views on that, and perhaps it's something that you could reflect on further.
Yes, the proposed modification that I mentioned that we reflect on, modification 15.0, is part of the strategic policy 15.1, but as part of our reflections, we'll ensure that paragraph 140 of the MPPF is reflected and that the exceptional circumstances needed to change the the Metropolitan Open Land boundaries, which, although, as you rightly say, they're all exceptional circumstances, we believe that some of the changes are justified from are relatively minor in impact. We'll ensure our review of that reflects paragraph MPPF 140.
Thank you. Did either you or Ms O'Donnell want to come back on that slightly different point that Mr. Coombe made? He made a general point about the evidence base doesn't justify the changes. Was there anything else you wanted to add? Mr. Coombe, I'm going to ask you to come in here in case I haven't articulated your question appropriately.
Thank you. My point is really focusing on WI3 because that's what we're interested in, but I've looked at other parts of the plan just summarily. Frankly, it's been very difficult. I'm unfamiliar with this process, and the lack of the contents, the lack of a signposting through has been a struggle. We've done our best. It appears that there are assertions for changes rather than evidence. The only strong evidence I've seen with proper study has been the GIS. It also appears that other changes to the plan have arisen as changes to MOL designation, I'm sorry, have arisen as a result of rather creeping erosion to MOL. I can give examples for WI3, which I know best, and I see that mentioned in the green infrastructure study, summary of other sites. Oh, well, there's a couple of buildings on the edge of them, and therefore they can't really be MOL altogether. The two I can refer you to in relation to WI3 are Planning Commission's 20/P0420 and 20/P3635. These are just two examples where there has been creeping erosion into the Metropolitan Open Land. Notwithstanding that erosion, which is unfortunate and has arisen as a result of planning permission rather than plan policy changes at the local plan stage, the planning officers recommended those developments for approval. Then the green infrastructure study says, well, we will accept the buildings that have encroached, but the rest of the site, in this case WI3, to the north of the current All England development, practice courts and open space, should remain Metropolitan Open Land. And that has now been contradicted in the local plan proposal because it takes out the whole of the site to the west of Church Road from Metropolitan Open Land.
Okay, thank you. I think just two things I'd like to say first in response to that. I'd like to just ask Miss O'Donnell again to maybe flesh out a little bit of the reasons why that these boundary changes are being proposed. I think you probably gave a fair summary just. But the second thing is, and perhaps this will just help you, Mr. Coombe, today, is we do have a separate session for week 3. So if I can help you at all, today, perhaps more about general points. Happy for you to kind of refer to E3 as an example, but some of your detailed questions about that allocation will be answered in the session next week. Thank you. Ms. O'Donnell, if you could just explain, just for the purposes of the hearing, the considerations and those reasons for the boundary changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I mean, Metropolitan Open Land is a somewhat tricky consideration when there is a planning application and a local plan happening at the same time. So I'm just going to focus on the local plan review side of things, so not to confuse those matters. So the green infrastructure study obviously looked at, in terms of Metropolitan Open Land, the criteria that is set out in London Plan Policy G3. So there are 4 pieces of criteria which are set out there. I'm not going to repeat those, but just touching on those, it refers to physical structure, open air facilities for leisure, recreation, sport, historic, recreational, biodiverse landscapes and features, and strategic corridors and green infrastructure networks. So all of the reviews, the site reviews that the consultants undertook and that the council subsequently undertook, focused on the criteria that is set out in the London Plan. So nothing else was really considered at that point when that review was taking place. So that, I think that those reviews are set out clearly in the evidence-based documents 15D1 and 18D3. And as a result of what took place in terms of those site reviews, the proposed changes were made through the local plan. I don't know if at this point we want to get into the detailed discussions of the boundary changes for any of the particular sites, or if you're just looking for more of a general overview.
No, that's fine. I think that answered your question fairly well. And I think the point here, Mr. Coombe, is that you're asking a question about why it didn't follow the GIS study. And essentially the council saying is because of these further reviews and the extra work that was undertaken, they decided to take a slightly different approach. That's a fair summary, isn't it, Ms. Butler?
Yes.
Thank you. Unless there's anything else, we can move on from that.
So there's in your hearing statement, there's another couple of alterations to the mole that are proposed as main modifications. So could you outline the justification for these 2 proposals, please?
Can I pass over to Ms. O'Donnell to start? Thanks.
If I could invite Ms. O'Donnell in, please.
Thank you. Apologies, I can only see, I can't see everybody in the room, so yeah, that's fine, thank you. I'm looking at question 2D from our hearing statement, unless you correct me. So we proposed 2 modifications which basically bring in 2 additional mole boundary amendments through the modifications. Both of these are, as you said, we've said they are of a minor nature. They are considered to both be anomalies in terms of where the original mole boundary was drawn. The first site was brought to the attention of the council at a very late stage in the local plan process. So unfortunately, it was not incorporated into the submitted plan and the policy map document 0D2. Upon review of a site visit, looking at the aerial boundaries and overlaying those with the GIS maps at the time, it's very clear that these 4, I'll direct you to the map that's shown on page 6 of our submitted statement. There's four properties which are residential. They are individually freehold owned. They do not form part of the wider cemetery that this mole referred to as a reference mole 03, which is Lower Morden Metropolitan Open Land. So in our consideration, as part of the proposed amendments, we put forward that these 4 sites should be removed from the wider mole site. Similarly, of a similar nature is the second proposed amendment, which is on pages 6 and 7 of our submitted statement. this is also a GIS cartographic error that was only spotted by our GIS team when the final maps were being published for the website. So when I say cartographic error, I don't want to use a technical term, but basically the line shown on the original map, which was done in 2014 with our sites and policies plan, did not correctly line up with the actual boundary of the piece of land behind the day nursery at that site. So that's another proposal that we have put forward as a main modification.
Okay, so this is one where the actual mapping technology has improved since the earlier iteration of the mole boundary. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, and that actually that accounts for most of the what we're calling anomalies of these mapping changes for mole in the plan, which are set out in the appendix to our statement.
Sorry, Ms. O'Donnell, if I can just invite you back in there and just to follow up on Mr. Coombe's point on particularly in regards to the wider WI3 site. So in terms of that site, that there are some mole boundaries proposed, mole boundary changes proposed. So what was the evidence that was taken into account to come to that conclusion?
Just in terms of WI3, the changes on that site, yes?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. So the evidence that we used included so a number of site visits were undertaken to look at the physical land boundaries that are on the site. As Mr. Coombe referenced, a number of planning applications have taken forward on that site over a number of years. Whether or not the site is open space or Metropolitan Open Land, planning applications have been approved. So that's also taken into consideration, that sometimes if buildings have been approved, they can have an impact on the openness of a Metropolitan Open Land. The Metropolitan Open Land for Wimbledon Park crosses Church Road. So it's quite a strong defined physical boundary there. So as part of our review in terms of the taking into consideration the London Plan criteria in policy G3, that's one of the things that we looked at. Those details are also set out in our evidence base and in the appendix to our statement. The consultants, when they undertook the review for this particular site, did identify that it is a very unique site So they did identify, they actually, I think, suggested that the site itself could have its own specific policy, but that was something that the council then kind of took into consideration and decided against, because that has ramifications for other issues. So in terms of the mole itself, we were just looking at the actual boundary of that site. And you will note that most the policies map boundaries shown in document 0D2, they do show that most of that site, which is to the west of Church Lane, is already removed from mole. So it's not currently designated as Metropolitan Open Land. So part of our review was looking at just not the entire site itself, but just where the current mole boundaries were, and looking at which parts of those boundaries met the criteria and which parts didn't, and how it impacted on how the buildings and the built form that is currently there impacted, and if it had any harm on the openness of the entire Wimbledon Park Metropolitan Open Land.
So this was a specific instance where the subsequent reviews following the green infrastructure study sort of moved the position on, and it was related to changes in kind of built form. So following planning permissions on that site. Is that a fair summary, Ms. O'Donnell?
That's definitely part of it, yes. I would say that the review for this site was a combination of the green infrastructure study, further reviews that took place in combination with the built form that is currently on the site, and also the built form that surrounds the site, because obviously Metropolitan Open Land needs to be, or it should be, distinguishable from the surrounding built form. So that forms an important factor in the assessment.
Thank you, Ms. O'Donnell. Ms. Roberts, you've got your hand up.
Hi, yeah, could I ask on this issue, in relation to that site, which I believe is practice courts at the moment, so if it is removed as MOL, would has the council considered that it would need to remain as open space, or would this inevitably end up accommodating development, like, for example, a new stadium? And has the council considered whether that might happen, and whether that might be a consideration that needs to be made in making the decision about that boundary change? Because clearly a boundary change to MOL makes it possible to build on the site in a way that wasn't before, and whether some kind of other designation might be needed. I suppose where I'm conscious that this particular site is being removed in the context of the wider proposed development on Wimbledon Park. So it is material, I think, and quite an important issue.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Mr. Coombe.
Thank you very much. May I please respond to a couple of comments that Ms. O'Donnell made? The first one was that buildings that have encroached, if you like, on MOL can have an impact on the openness of the rest of it. I rather fear that makes my point, that if you begin to encroach, there is a slippery slope. In fact, the officer's reports on both of those applications said it wouldn't have that effect. And I invite you to I can send the details, but I invite you to look at those. The second point is that GIS study, I call it the Green Infrastructure Study, was fully published, and details were set out in it, and it explains its reasoning. We find it very difficult to understand what evidence there is if the council simply says it went round the site, it heard from a couple of landowners, and it decided to make a change. We don't quite see the evidence, which is not transparent, and it's not clear why those decisions might be made.
Thank you, Mr. Coombe. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you. Just going back a couple of points to the council's evidence-based approach, I think I'd say that it was probably correct to have the evidence base from the third-party consultants and then to follow that up with their own site visits and reviews. So I do think that was the correct approach, particularly in relation to the practice courts in the most northern part of the site. I'm not sure about whether there was any site visits undertaken by the consultants, but if you was to look at that portion of the site from a desktop computer-based perspective, you would think that it is quite flat and underdeveloped. When actually visiting the site, you'll find that there's lots of terraced arrangements and it's an incredibly developed part of that site. So I actually think it is a sound approach to have the evidence and then to follow that up with further investigations, and like Mr. O'Donnell alluded to, making sure that evidence is thorough and up to date. So that's the first point I'd make on the general approach to that being justified. I think in relation to Ms. Roberts' point about the potential future development of that land, should it be removed from Mole, I think it's important to remember the purpose of the boundary review, which is, does that land serve the purpose of being Metropolitan Open Land? And having that designation in the first place is to make sure it fulfills those functions. So I think that's the point I'd make there, and council can comment on whether or not it's appropriate to have another designation in its place. But I think in terms of considering MOL, you need to consider the boundary amendment against whether it fulfills those purposes in the London Plan and MPPF, rather than what might happen speculatively in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. So, Ms. Butler.
Just want to add a few points for clarity, particularly taking into account Mr. Coombe's the issues he's raised about the complexity of the planning system and accessing documents. Just to be clear, as set out in 18D3, the council's not proposing to remove all the Metropolitan Open Land from the existing west side of Church Road. Do intend to retain, I suppose you'd call it Hegman Hill and the lands to the back. 18D3, page 3, shows a map of the before and after. In addition, just to add in response to CPRE London, and to emphasize Ms. O'Donnell's points, we need to assess Mole based on the criteria in the London Plan and the MPPF. So none of the sites were assessed with a view of stopping any development on any mole or allowing developments. That's not part of the criteria set out in the MPPF or the London Plan.
So as we said, I think that we're going to discuss the WI3 site in a lot more detail at our session next week, and that will include the implications of the Mole designation and what that means for the allocation. But I think we're going to move on now to ML3. Yeah. We're going to move on to just looking in a bit more detail at site MO3, which hasn't got a separate session allocated to it in this hearing phase. So if we can move the discussion onto that, please.
Yeah, and apologies in this session if we do go a bit forwards and backwards in a few respects, just to answer our questions. So as Inspector Ford just mentioned, we want to briefly touch on site allocation MO3. enabling residential development and release of adjoining land from MOL, including area for future development, South Stand, granted planning permission under reference 19 P4094 following a stage 2 approval in April 2021. That's for 6 stories, building of 77 units. I do have some questions on the kind of assumptions underpinning some of this, but I'm going to come back to those in a second, because I want to start with, we've got a statement of common ground and the parties agree that the site should be removed from MOL. And modification is proposed. I'll come back to you, Ms. Butler, and you can perhaps talk about that in a second. But just I want to float this for everybody here this morning. Is it sufficiently clear from the plan itself that the intention is to remove from MOL? The allocation says impacts a designated open space. Well, yes, it does. Protected open space and Metropolitan Open Land. And kind of following on from the questions that we've just been having on these changes, you know, the site allocation, is it correct that it would need to set out what amendments are being made? And then also there's a second part to that question, which is the criteria sufficiently strong to ensure that there aren't any implications from a later resubmission when that land is no longer designated as MOL? So if we could just deal with that first, and then after that, I'm going to come back to ask some questions on the wider parcel of land. So we're just dealing with the rectangular shape that was granted permission. Is that clear, Ms. Butler? Is that?
I'm going to pass over to Mr. Doyle, but she might come back.
Was that question clear, Ms. O'Donnell? Questions?
Yes, can I take the first part of your question first, and then I might double check on the second part of your question. So I believe the first part of your question was, is it sufficiently clear through the site allocation that the intention is to remove MOL? So taking that into consideration, I do believe that the site allocation MO3 sets out, as you said, that the site is part of a wider piece of MOL, and so obviously it needs to be removed from MOL to enable the residential development to come forward. We have proposed an additional modification on, I will give you the reference, AM 4.23A. We've proposed it as a factual correction rather than a main modification, and that is basically to remove the reference to the site being Metropolitan Open Land in the site allocation, so that that makes it sufficiently clear that that portion of the site will no longer be Metropolitan Open Land for the in terms of the policy map and the site allocation.
I'm just looking at that additional modification, the proposed one now, Ms. O'Donnell. I still don't. I think this was the difficulty we had with it, in that it didn't appear clear from the allocation that that was the intention, that it was to be removed from MOL. And this goes back to the point I think we made earlier, that if you read across a number of different parts of the plan and different documents and the policies map, you might pick up that it's been removed from MOL. But I don't think the allocation is abundantly clear on that point. And I think also the proposed additional modification would just, it doesn't even acknowledge that it was in MOL then. So again, I don't think it's clear from the plan. If we're talking about the exceptional circumstances that are necessary to make these kinds of alterations, you know, there does need to be more clarity there, I think. Have you got any views on that, Ms. O'Donnell?
Yeah, I take your point. If a reader is picking up the plan for the first time, potentially there is some additional wording that we could add to the site allocation. Thinking back to the council's review that we're going to add additional wording to the strategic policy as well, there's probably a stronger link that we could make there. So maybe that's something we need to take away and think about.
Yes, thank you, Ms. O'Donnell and Ms. Butler, if that can be added to the log. So there was a second part of the question, Inspector Aston. So just to articulate the second part of Inspector Aston's question, it was, could there be any unintended consequences of a premature release from the mall of this site? So if there was say a resubmission of an application for housing on that site without all the associated Section 106 because it's not in the mall anymore, is the allocation policy robust enough to sort of guard against something like that? I'll ask Ms. O'Donnell again to come in on that, please.
You have me thinking, Inspector. If rereading the site allocation in that way, that may need to be something that we need to look at again. I do think that it is clear that given that the very special circumstances have been demonstrated through the approved planning application, that this portion of the site, and only this portion of the site in the council's view, meets the exceptional circumstances to remove it from mole. But I do take your point in what those exceptional circumstances are, and if that were to change. The planning application does have an agreed Section 106 agreement, and I'm not sure off the top of my head if the approval has been implemented to date, and that's something that I think others in the room could probably confirm with us today. So I'm not sure if that's something that may factor into this conversation as well.
Thank you, Ms. O'Donnell. Any further thoughts on that, Ms. Butler?
Not at this stage, no thanks.
So is that an action point just in the general sort of review of the effectiveness of those policies, thinking about whether, I'm not saying that the allocation needs to be changed, but just in terms of that consideration, does the allocation need more in it about what the exceptional circumstances are? I mean, I see, have you got the allocation? I mean, the site allocation itself does say intensification of sporting activity on the wider site may be supported by enabling development on this site, subject to meeting planning policy evidence and consultation. Any enabling development will be expected to directly fund long-term capital investment in sporting facilities in Tooting and Mitcham hub. So that may well be robust enough, but just in terms of thinking about that policy and the effects of removing it from mall, if that's just taken into considerations and you give us a view on that, that would be useful, I think.
We'll take that away.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett.
Yeah, I can maybe just help, sir, in terms of the current status of the application. So my client is entering into a contract with Hab Intake Housing Association. We're fully on board with delivering the residential.
Sorry, Mr. Bennett, I just missed which housing association that was.
Sorry?
I just missed which housing.
Oh, sorry, Hab Intake Housing Association. So they specialise, sir, in accessible housing. They actually wrote the Lifetime Homes guidance. So they are the identified housing provider for the accommodation block that's been approved under the planning permission. They have appointed a full professional team who are now doing the technical work in respect to the pre-commencement planning conditions that were imposed on the reference 19/P4094, which was granted at the end of the year. So in reality, sirs, that planning application is going to be implemented, and they expect to be on site at the beginning of 2023. Pre-commencement applications to discharge should be going in the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. It's very helpful. I just want to move on now to this the wider issue, if you like, the wider site, and it's this question of whether the whole site should be removed from Mole. When I say the whole site, I don't have the plan to show on the screen, but your evidence clearly shows that plan that has the area marked in orange. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. So, yeah, so it's the area in yellow, orange that we're kind of referring to. So we're going to move on to that issue. But I'd like to hear from the council first as to why they don't consider that the wider site should also be removed from Mole.
I can be brief. Our Green Infrastructure Study 2020 reference OD20 didn't support removing any of the site from Metropolitan Open Land, including the elements that now has planning permission for housing. We, as Mr. Doyle said, we conducted further reviews, especially against the London Plan criteria for Metropolitan Open Land, and looked in particular about a contiguous mall and contiguous built-up area, particularly the criteria in policy G3, Metropolitan Open Land. We felt that it justified the removal of the site with planning permission for housing from the Metropolitan Open Land, as it's contiguous with the houses on the Sutton side. So the site itself, it sits on the borough boundary with Sutton Council, and to the southwest, Poulter Park is Metropolitan Open Land in Sutton. To the northeast, there's National Trust land. This is part of the Wandle Valley, and Metropolitan Open Land covers the whole area around the site, apart from slightly to the opposite side of the road. We didn't feel that removing the whole site from Metropolitan Open Land was justified. I'd also point out that we've considered it again since receiving this request, because the request came in the evidence in May, and our evidence is removing this site from the contiguous Metropolitan Open Land isn't justified.
Okay. Can I just ask before I go around the table? So essentially, the council's approach is that the VSC case, the very special circumstances case, which I think, you know, is widely held to be a higher test than the exceptional circumstances. That's the basis on which you're agreeing to the removal of the site from Mole. I appreciate there's the other issues in relation to G3 and the policy, but fundamentally, because you've granted planning permission, therefore that indicates to the council that that's a higher bar, isn't it, than the exceptional? So is it correct that if that VSC is passed, the exceptional circumstances are going to exist to take that site out?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Questions for Mr. Bennett, or is it Miss Patel? Okay. Whoever wants to take these. Just on some of the assumptions, and I'm interested to hear your view, given Miss Butler's, what we've just heard from Miss Butler. I'm going to ask a few things here. So could you briefly outline the kind of development history for the site? Just to give us a little bit of background and what's intended for the master plan. You can just be brief. So that's the first point. The second point is, with Watermeads and Poulter Park to the south and north, I haven't visited the site. We will visit the site. But does the site not have a stronger affinity with those than the existing built-up area, which you say is part of the fabric of the built-up area to the west? And what we're kind of getting at here is that first criteria of policy G3 of the London plan. Because essentially, if my reading of your evidence is correct, then you're saying that it's part of the built-up area. So just your views on that, please, and those two strands. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll just do a brief summary of the planning history and the master plan, and then Lauren will deal with the criteria for the MOL wider release justification. So yeah, the club does have an extensive planning history, as you may have seen from my statement. I mean, the original stadium was developed in the early 2000s. There was an approved master plan back in 2007, and the various elements for that are sort of set out in my statement. You can see there are the recent planning permission that's been granted is the enabling development for items 1 on my appendix plan that I waved in front of you, and also item 3. So that's a sports hall at the front of the site, which will be enabled by this new residential planning permission, and the changing block at the back of the site.
If I could just pause there for a moment, just following on from that, whoever's going to answer the second part of the question, perhaps if you could also just include the implications in terms of that criteria, if those small planning permission parcels, which I'll refer to for want of a better phrase, 1, 2, and 3, were implemented.
Okay. So yeah, various elements over the years have been implemented. There are outstanding elements that to be implemented, including items 1 and 3. One of the next major development that the club would like to embark upon is number 2 on the appendix, which is the South Stand redevelopment. That was originally included in the master plan. It's been subject to various material alterations and so on over the years, but they do feel that a release from MOL will give them a little bit more freedom in terms of the uses that they would like to develop in that part of the site, and just give them a little bit more freedom generally in terms of the application of MOL policy. They're very active, sirs, and they're always submitting applications on this site, and we tend to find that every time an application is submitted, we get embroiled in MOL policy, which shouldn't really be applied anymore to this site, because since the main stadium was developed, and you'll see when you visit the site, sirs, that the whole character of it has fundamentally changed. About 60% of the land is previously developed land. So a good example recently is we've actually been asked to submit, the club are doing a partnership with Merton Education Department for teaching young people how to lay railway tracks. And we've been forced to make a planning application for that. So, and frankly, it's ridiculous. It shouldn't have needed an application. We can't get it validated because of the level of information that is being sought by the planning authority. And it's a really good example of why greater freedom would be the right thing to do for this site, and a wider release. So yes, in terms of, I'll probably let Lauren develop on the criteria for the wider release, but I think in terms of the way the site relates to Poulter Park and so on, the proposal from our clients is that we don't intend to release the whole of the site. It's the central part and the front part of the site. And we feel that the rear part of the site, which includes an ecological zone, again, the maintenance of which is being protected through the Section 106 agreement. We feel that the rear part of the site has that stronger connection with Pulsar Park and the rest of the wider mole designation, and the front part of the site has a greater relationship with the existing urban grain and the road frontage and so on.
So just can I just pick up on some of the Mr.
Yeah.
Bennett? So in terms of you said it's very active in terms of planning activity. So of those applications, how many are you having to demonstrate very special circumstances on? Have you got a view on that, as opposed to those that are judged to be not inappropriate development?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we do get some flexibility from the planning authority, but I think because there's always that backdrop of the MOL policy, it's never straightforward, and I think the club are finding that the rail track application is a good example, because they want to move really quickly with the education department and deliver their educational program, and because we're stuck in planning, they can't move as quickly as they'd like to, sirs, and they feel that their everyday operations are being fettered by the MOL.
I did have a question, just following up from that, Mr. Bennett. It was on the implications of, just bear with me 1 second. Yeah, it was about you've just mentioned a few implications, but are there any other implications you wanted to set out for the hearing if the land was to remain as mole? That was it. I think you've probably answered most of them.
Yeah.
But I think in asking you the question, perhaps I'm asking you to look a bit forward to the kind of implementation of the master plan and any kind of future plans that there might be for that site.
Yeah, I think we would, in terms of the next steps of development at the site. I think it's inevitable, even though there's an extant planning permission on the south stand. I think it's inevitable that in terms of planning policy underlying the site, that any application submitted is going to be an extremely onerous and lengthy process.
Would the site remaining in MOL prejudice the future master plan?
I think it would make it more difficult than it needs to be, sirs.
Not to the point where it couldn't.
Not to the point of being impossible, no. But I think the club would benefit from that little bit more flexibility, a little bit more pragmatism from the council in terms of moving these developments forward in the future.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you at the end, Ms. Butler. Ms. Patel, that second part there.
Thank you. I'll try not to cover any of the points that Nigel's already raised, but as Nigel says, 60% of the site is currently previously developed. The area we've shown in our appendix in our hearing statement in yellow is all hard standing or built form. Those that know the site will know there's quite a substantial stadium within that area there as well. And number two is where the extant permission for the south stand is that Tooting and Mitcham would one day hope to build out. What we are proposing, as Nigel says, is that around 2/3 of it should be released from the MOL, and we say should instead have a designation for a sports and community use, which would restrict it from inappropriate development in the future, but allow the community functions and the sporting functions of the club to continue slightly less hindered. As Nigel says, we do propose the third of the site to the east of the site to remain as MOL. This part of the site is much more open, it's much more green, and it does also serve a link purpose between the Wandle MOL to the north and the Poulter Park MOL to the south in Sutton. So in terms of assessing the site against London Plan Policy G3, we have done that. We've tested this proposal against those 4 purposes. Purpose 1 is that it is a requirement, is whether the site contributes to the physical structure of London by being clearly distinguishable from the built-up area. And what we say in response to this first criteria is the part of the site we suggest should be removed from MOL is predominantly, obviously, as I've already said, hard standing and substantial built form. It sits immediately adjacent to the existing built-up urban area, and in our view clearly reads as part of that built-up area rather than being distinguishable from it. The second criteria of policy G3 is it includes open air facilities, especially for leisure, recreation, sport, the arts or cultural activities, which serve either the whole or significant parts of London. The 2 pitches, admittedly there are 2 pitches which are green, one of them's artificial, one of them's not, within the area which we feel is more urbanised. So they do contain open air sporting facilities, but are wholly surrounded by hard standing and built form and the existing urban area. Furthermore, while the site serves the local community and London Borough of Merton, it does not serve the whole or significant parts of London by any stretch. So it doesn't, in our view, conflict with that criteria. Criteria 3 of policy G3 is it contains features of landscape, historic, recreational, biodiverse or interest of either national or metropolitan value. There's absolutely no part of that yellow area which serves any of those functions. So absolutely, we're fine in terms of criteria 3. Criteria 4 of policy G3 is it forms part of a strategic corridor, node or link in the network of green infrastructure and meets one of the above criteria. It does, in our view, and it's quite clear from the inset that we've included within our plan, that there is linking green infrastructure through this part of London Borough of Merton and Sutton. Our site, in our view, which is the yellow part, does not serve any purpose in that it is not green, essentially. By retaining the eastern third of the site, that helps to maintain a very strong link between those 2 parts of the MOL, north and south. So removing the yellow part, in our view, would not hinder or have any detrimental impact on the 4th MOL criteria as set out in London Plan Policy G3. So essentially, you know, our case is that the yellow part of the site, as we've shown on that plan, does not serve the 4 purposes as set out as policy G3 of the London Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, so I think the Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. I need to say a few things about this, and one, the first point is that you've referred to hard standing, but hard standing in the glossary of the MPPF is not PDL. It's not previously developed land, and so it feels really like important to make clear that just because something is hard standing doesn't mean that it's PDL, previously developed, and that I think your calculations there might be wrong. I think removing a central section of MOL clearly compromises the wider MOL and allows for encroachment and compromises the whole wider area of MOL. I mean, I'm slightly stunned to hear that the idea that we should be making it easier to allow development. I mean, the whole point of MOL is to make it difficult, and only to make it possible if it's ancillary to the use and so forth. And even then, it should be it shouldn't be easy. So I'm not sure how that argument works. Buildings on MOL do happen, and I suppose there's a term washover, which is that you can, the designation washes over those buildings, and providing they are ancillary to use, or maybe they've been given permission, but that was on the basis that the rest of it would stay MOL, then I don't see how just the fact of having a building there should mean that the rest of the MOL should therefore, that therefore a patch should be removed. I don't think that argument stands. And I think that in general, the implications of taking these arguments as being good arguments are far reaching, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Patel, just following on from that, I just want to probe a little bit more about, we heard earlier, you said that you've left the kind of southeastern area of Mole unaffected because it has more, it's got some affinity with Poulter Park and then the wider MOL. Could the same not be said for parcel 2? And following on from that, and I say that because I don't know what's proposed on parcel 2. So I'm going to ask you if you could give me just a little bit of a flavour as to the type of development that's being granted for those parcels 1, 2 and 3 on the plan that you held up earlier.
Yes, of course. So just for everyone else's ease, I'll show the plan again. So area 2 does have an extant permission for the south stand. So that's the part of the site that the clients would like to bring forward for that south stand at some point in time. So it's got permission for substantial big built form.
What kind of built form are we talking about here? Is it a single story stand? Is it?
It's I'll defer to Nigel on that one.
It's more like two stories. So it's got seating on the lower part and boxes on the upper part.
We can review the application, but
it would be helpful so I can forward through plans for it.
Back to that, Mr. Bull.
So I believe that area 3 has only got extant permission for a small changing room block. So it's a very small building. It's not substantial built form, and that does fall within the area to the southeast. So we have allowed that to in our evidence to remain as MOL. And if you do visit the site, you will see that this part of the site that's to remain as MOL is a very open pitch with just a fence around it. There's no built form or hard standing around it at all. It is wrapped around by the ecological area and tree belt, which forms part of the Wandle Valley connections as well. So you will see if you visit the site, it's much more open and green, hence why we have retained it within the MOL designation, whereas this area is quite the opposite.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Butler, just your general, or Ms. O'Donnell, your general response, but also just in that as well, just a question that's just come to my mind. Perhaps a commentary on why the same view wasn't taken for parcel 2 that you've taken with the Mole 3 allocation.
On the response to the earlier matters, I don't really have much to say apart from we did the same review as Ms. Patel and came up with a different conclusion.
I think it's safe to, I think it's safe to say our main concerns were it's criteria 1, and a lot of that is only distinguishable from a site visit. So that's where those main questions were going.
And also just to echo CPRE London, that hard standing and sports pitches are common to Mole. On criteria, on the site 2, it does have extent plan permission. When we visited the site, it hasn't been implemented. The site feels open. It's right beside the element of Poulter Park. There's a sense of openness that meets the criteria in the London plan. And while in the long term that site may be redeveloped, at the present time a review of it looks and feels open and contiguous with the Metropolitan Open Land. So at this time, pending the delivery of the south stands, it feels like a sporting use that would be in common with Mall, hence coming to that conclusion, unlike, say, housing.
Did the OSS recommend anything in relation to this wider site? Removal of the stadium footprint or
The
pitches, car park?
the green infrastructure study.
Yes, sorry.
Let me just check my recollection and just bring up the number. Is it didn't recommend any changes. Page 20 of Martin's Green Infrastructure Study 2020 shows that the site was considered for removal from mall and other open space designations by the consultants, and it didn't recommend any changes. As evidenced in 18D3, we reviewed the site subsequently and considered that in part because of the contiguous line with the houses at Sutton, that the site that has planning permission for homes should be removed, but the rest of the area should be retained. Oh, Ms. O'Donnell, I think, is indicating she might have something to add.
Yeah, please come in, Ms. O'Donnell.
Thank you. Just very quickly, another quick point that I would like to make is that the entire site currently falls within the Wandle Valley Regional Park, and parts of the site are also green corridor. So that also factors into our consideration as to how the site meets the London Plan criteria.
Thank you. And if just finally, Ms. Scott, if you could just give your view on the proposed modification MM 5.1C, please. And this is following on about MPPF paragraph 142.
Don't have that to hand at the moment. I'm just going to defer to Mr. O'Donnell while I find it.
That's fine. Take your time.
Inspectors, I found the modification. Can I confirm what the question is with regards to the modification?
Yeah, it was just to talk us through the modification and why it's required, please.
Okay. I believe this is in reference to one of the other questions in matter 5. So it linked with the MPPF 142, paragraph 142 about compensatory improvements. So as Mr. Bennett mentioned, I do believe that part of the site has been secured through the Section 106 agreement of the planning application, in that the rear part of the site is going to be some sort of biodiversity and ecological habitats over a long period of time. And I believe as part of the planning application, that was to factor in the MPPF paragraph 142 in terms of compensatory improvements for ecological areas due to the fact that part of the site was being removed from mole. So we felt that it was necessary to include this paragraph in the site allocation to make it clear.
Mr. Bennett.
Yes, just one point in terms of Tara's points on the existing character of the site and with the south stand number 2 on the plan. So whilst that hasn't been implemented as yet, it was part of the 2007 consent, and and all those pre-commencement conditions were cleared, and the club have a very clear position in law that part of the site can be, what they got consent for, and subsequent amendments to that over the years, that can be implemented. So I think it's important when the council are looking at their baseline assessment for considering future mole, that is a established legal fallback position for that site. So I think it's important that that's taken into consideration.
I mean, that's correct, Mr. Benny, about a fallback, but it's not quite as clear cut as that. You mentioned that there's 2007 consent, so and a start has been made on site, presumably for that permission to be implemented. But it's 2022. So could it be said why you haven't implemented the permission since that time? Or perhaps you could explain why there's such a long
I think
period.
obviously the community function of the club is something that's been developed over the years, and it's grown over the years. So there was a big vision at the start of that whole process of what the master plan would look like. And obviously over the years, they have implemented various parts of it. And the intention has always been to complete the master plan. It's something that the club have always been very clear on. So that intention to build out number 2 has always been there, sirs. It's just that, you know, obviously it's a public-private partnership, and they haven't been in the position to implement it as yet. But it's very clear that that's their intention is to do so.
And I think just to wrap up on that for me, and that's the reason why we asked the questions earlier. It's all very well having an intent, Mr. Bennett, but that's why we asked those questions about the implications, and that's why we think it's important that that's looked at again.
So yeah, I think just to sum up there, we get that there's a difference in opinion in terms of what the your evidence is saying about the site and what the council's is, and that's something that we'll have to reflect on as the examination progresses. So I think is there anything else on this site before we have a short adjournment? Ms. Butler, Ms. O'Donnell. Okay, so in that case, I suggest it's just approaching 22. I think if we come back, I think 12 at 12. So if we could adjourn now, and we'll come back at 12.